Could a family really lose everything over something as small as a few plants and a fence? That's exactly what happened to the Johnsons, a hard-working black family of 4 living in a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. Their dream of stability began to crumble when the HOA hit them with relentless fines, escalating over details so minor they seemed laughable, until they weren't. What started as a few warning letters quickly turned into threats of foreclosure, leaving the Johnsons in shock. They thought they were being unfairly targeted, but soon the truth became darker. The HOA president had hidden motives, with ties to a developer eager to push families like the Johnsons out to make way for luxury housing. The fight for their home became bigger than just money. It became a fight for dignity, justice, and the right to stay in the community they helped build. The Johnson family had always believed their home was more than just 4 walls and a roof. For David Johnson and his wife, Carla, their modest 2-story house on the edge of a small suburban neighborhood represented sacrifice, determination, and the hope of giving their children, Malik and Jasmine, a place they could always return to. Every corner of the house carried a story. Malik's first steps in the living room, Jasmine's birthday parties in the backyard, the late nights where David sat at the kitchen table balancing bills with weary eyes. But beneath the calm exterior of their neighborhood, tension was quietly building. The HOA had become notorious for its strict enforcement of rules, often nitpicking homeowners for the smallest infractions. Some neighbors ignored the warnings and paid the occasional fine, brushing it off as an annoyance. Others fell into fear, knowing that once the HOA started targeting you, the pressure only grew worse. For the Johnsons, trouble began with a simple letter. It arrived one humid summer afternoon, tucked neatly into their mailbox. Carla had picked it up after work, her nurse's scrubs damp with sweat after a long shift. At first she thought little of it, a reminder about community dues maybe. But when she opened the envelope, her chest tightened. The letter claimed their front lawn was unsightly due to a few overgrown plants near the walkway. Carla felt her stomach churn as she placed the letter on the counter for David to read. They both knew they hadn't neglected their yard. The grass was mowed, the flower beds neat, but there were indeed a couple of shrubs that had grown higher than the HOA's acceptable height. It seemed ridiculous. A warning would have been fine, but the letter included a fine of $150, payable within 2 weeks. David tried to brush it off, assuring Carla they'd trim the plants that weekend. He reminded her that they had been through worse. After all, their lives had never been free from struggle. As a black family in a predominantly white suburb, they had often felt the weight of being judged differently, of needing to work twice as hard just to be seen as equals. But this felt targeted in a way that unsettled them both. The weekend came, and David trimmed the bushes, cleaned up the front yard, and even added new mulch to make the space look tidy. He sent proof of the work to the HOA as instructed, believing that would end the matter. But 2 weeks later, another letter came. This time the fine had doubled to $300, citing that their wooden fence in the backyard was non-compliant. The Johnsons were stunned. Their fence had been there since they bought the house, and it matched several others in the neighborhood. Why was theirs suddenly a problem? The HOA demanded they replace it with a newer, more expensive model that adhered to updated community standards. David's hands shook as he read the letter. Replacing the fence would cost thousands of dollars, money they simply didn't have. Between Carla's hospital shifts and David's work as a delivery driver, their budget was stretched thin already. Malik was preparing for college applications, and Jasmine was involved in extracurriculars that carried their own expenses. The thought of spending so much money on a fence felt impossible. Still, the fines kept coming. Each new letter carried more threats, additional penalties, legal action, and eventually the possibility of foreclosure if the fines were left unpaid. Carla couldn't sleep at night, her mind racing with fear of losing the only home their children had ever known. David grew more frustrated, his pride bruised by the feeling of being powerless against an HOA that seemed determined to crush them. It wasn't long before whispers began to spread in the neighborhood. Some of their neighbors avoided eye contact, unwilling to get involved in the Johnsons' fight. Others quietly expressed sympathy, but warned that the HOA was not to be crossed. The Johnsons began to realize they weren't just battling unfair rules, they were up against a system that thrived on intimidation. As the months dragged on, the situation worsened. The fines ballooned into the thousands, pushing the Johnsons to the brink of financial collapse. Malik overheard his parents arguing late at night, voices tight with worry, and began to wonder if he would even be able to stay in the neighborhood he grew up in. Jasmine cried when she asked her mother if they were going to lose their house, her young heart unable to carry the weight of uncertainty. But it was at a neighborhood meeting that the Johnsons finally glimpsed the deeper truth. David attended reluctantly, hoping to plead their case. As he sat in the back listening to the HOA president, Mr. Whitaker, outline plans for neighborhood improvement, his stomach sank. Whitaker spoke passionately about modernizing the community and hinted at partnerships with developers who wanted to invest in the area. David's mind raced as he connected the dots. The aggressive targeting, the impossible fines, the sudden push for updated fences and stricter standards. This wasn't about beautifying the neighborhood. It was about driving out families like his to make room for something bigger, shinier, and richer. That night when David returned home, his expression was heavy with grief, but also something else: determination. The Johnsons were not just fighting to save their house anymore. They were fighting against an injustice that could strip not only them, but their entire community of the homes they loved. The battle had only just begun. The days that followed were filled with an invisible heaviness pressing down on the Johnson household. Each morning, Carla walked to the mailbox with a pit in her stomach, dreading what she might find. The envelopes always looked the same: thin, stark white, stamped with the HOA's emblem, carrying words that had the power to unravel their lives. Every letter was another reminder that their home, their safe place, was under siege. Malik and Jasmine felt the tension, even if their parents tried to shield them from it. Malik, now a high school senior, noticed how his father's shoulders seemed to slump more each night after long delivery shifts. Jasmine, only 12, clung to her mother more often, asking questions Carla couldn't answer. Their once lively home, filled with laughter and noisy conversations, grew quieter, the silence broken only by hushed discussions about overdue fines and impossible deadlines. David wrestled with frustration. He had always believed that hard work and perseverance could protect his family, but the HOA's relentless pressure was crushing that belief. The fence issue escalated quickly. Despite his proof that several other fences in the neighborhood looked just like theirs, the HOA dismissed his appeals. They added another fine, this one citing that the paint on the side of their house was faded and not in line with community standards. David knew the paint was perfectly acceptable, but reason seemed irrelevant in this fight. At night, Carla searched the internet for stories of other homeowners facing similar battles. What she discovered shocked her. Across the country, HOAs had been accused of weaponizing fines, pushing families into foreclosure, and even collaborating with developers eager to take over neighborhoods. Each story mirrored their own in chilling detail. The Johnsons weren't alone in this fight, but knowing that offered little comfort. If anything, it deepened their fear. One evening, as David sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of letters, he decided to dig deeper into Mr. Whitaker, the HOA president. He learned that Whitaker was more than just a strict rule enforcer. He had close ties to a real estate developer who had been buying up properties in nearby neighborhoods. Homes were being flipped into high-priced rentals or torn down entirely to make way for modern townhouses. The pattern was clear. Families like the Johnsons were being squeezed out, replaced by wealthier residents who fit the new vision of the community. When David shared this discovery with Carla, her eyes filled with tears. She realized that their family wasn't just dealing with unfair fines, they were pawns in a larger scheme of gentrification. Their roots in the community, their children's memories, their sacrifices. It all meant nothing to people like Whitaker, who saw homes as dollar signs instead of lives. As the pressure grew, cracks began to form in the Johnsons' resilience. Malik considered delaying his college applications, worried about burdening his parents with more expenses. Jasmine grew quieter at school, unable to explain to her friends why her family seemed so troubled. Carla carried the weight of it all on her chest like a boulder, smiling for her children while crying alone in the bathroom. Yet, beneath the grief, a spark of determination was beginning to grow. The Johnsons realized that if they gave in, not only would they lose their home, but Whitaker's plan would succeed. Other families, too afraid to fight, would be forced out one by one until the neighborhood they knew was unrecognizable. Their first step was to attend another HOA meeting, this time not to plead, but to listen carefully. The room was filled with neighbors, some curious, others visibly uneasy. Whitaker spoke with his usual polished tone about community improvements, painting the Johnsons' situation as an example of why standards were necessary. David felt anger boiling in his chest as Whitaker casually dismissed the hardship his family was enduring. But what struck David most wasn't Whitaker's speech. It was the reaction of the neighbors. Some nodded in agreement, afraid to oppose him, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces betraying doubt. Perhaps they too had felt the sting of unreasonable fines, or perhaps they simply didn't like the idea of families being pushed out. David left that meeting with a realization they weren't entirely alone. The Johnsons began reaching out quietly to neighbors they trusted. They shared their story, showing copies of the fines, the mounting costs, and the evidence of Whitaker's connections to the developer. Some neighbors were shocked, others hesitant, but a few expressed outrage. The Johnsons weren't the only ones being targeted. An elderly couple down the street had been fined for having discolored shingles, even though their roof was perfectly fine. Another family had been ordered to remove a swing set their children loved, labeled as unsightly. Piece by piece, the truth began to spread. What had once seemed like isolated incidents now looked like a deliberate pattern. Families who had lived in the neighborhood for decades were being systematically pressured out. Despite the growing awareness, the Johnson situation worsened. The HOA filed a lien against their property, a legal step that could eventually lead to foreclosure if the fines weren't paid. It was a crushing blow, one that left Carla shaking with panic. But David, though exhausted, refused to let Whitaker win. He began to research legal options, seeking out attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. The first few calls were disheartening. The costs of legal representation were high, and many lawyers warned that HOA cases were difficult to win. But one firm showed interest after David explained Whitaker's developer connections. They suggested that if enough evidence could be gathered, the Johnsons might not only protect their home, but expose corruption on a larger scale. For the first time in months, hope flickered in the Johnson household. The road ahead would be brutal, but the Johnsons were no longer just victims of circumstance. They were fighters, standing against a system designed to silence them. Still, the risk was immense. If they failed, they could lose everything: their house, their stability, their sense of belonging. But if they succeeded, they could inspire an entire community to resist. The Johnsons knew one thing with certainty: they could not give up. And so, as autumn leaves began to fall, the Johnson family prepared for the fight of their lives, unaware that the battle ahead would expose not only corruption, but the lengths to which some people would go to destroy a dream. The lien against their home was no longer just a threat on paper. It was a ticking clock, a countdown to ruin. Each time David passed the family's front gate, he couldn't shake the thought that it might soon belong to someone else. The once safe streets of their neighborhood, lined with oak trees and modest homes, began to feel hostile, as if every brick and fence post was complicit in the scheme. Carla tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Malik and Jasmine, but the strain was visible. The dinner table had once been filled with chatter about school projects and neighborhood gossip. Now it was dominated by whispered strategy sessions about legal fees, evidence gathering, and timelines. Malik's college acceptance letters went unopened on the counter. Jasmine doodled wedding cakes in her notebooks, dreams of her cousin's wedding she was supposed to attend, only to overhear her parents worrying they might not have a house by then. The Johnsons' struggle had become the family's new rhythm, and the beat was exhausting. David spent evenings combing through old HOA newsletters, searching for inconsistencies. Carla gathered testimonies from neighbors quietly willing to talk. Each discovery painted a darker picture of Whitaker's leadership. There were sudden rule changes passed without proper votes, fines selectively enforced, and suspicious property sales to shell companies linked to the same developer. The web of connections was no longer coincidence. It was deliberate. But knowledge was one thing, and proof was another. The Johnsons needed allies, and they needed visibility. Carla suggested reaching out beyond their neighborhood. She had read about families in other towns who had gone public with their HOA struggles, and in some cases managed to turn the tide. It was risky, but silence was no longer an option. They began with small steps. Carla contacted a local community activist group known for fighting unfair housing practices. At first, she was unsure if anyone would take notice. After all, it was just one family against a neighborhood board. But when she explained the ties to developers, the activists leaned in. They knew the pattern all too well. What was happening to the Johnsons wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a wave of gentrification reshaping entire communities, especially those with deep black roots. Within days, the group agreed to help amplify the Johnsons' story. A local journalist was introduced to David and Carla, and after hearing their plight, she asked to publish an investigative piece. The Johnsons hesitated at first. What if going public made Whitaker even more aggressive? What if neighbors turned against them? But then David looked at his children, the fear in their eyes, and knew hiding would only guarantee defeat. The article ran a week later. It painted a vivid picture of a hard-working black family fighting to save their home from an HOA that seemed determined to push them out. The journalist included quotes from neighbors who supported them, and she hinted at Whitaker's suspicious developer ties. The story was raw, emotional, and undeniable. The impact was immediate. Some neighbors who had stayed silent out of fear began approaching the Johnsons, offering quiet words of encouragement. Others were still hesitant, wary of retaliation, but the silence of complicity began to crack. On social media, the article was shared widely, with readers outraged by the injustice. Strangers reached out, offering advice and solidarity. But with support came backlash. The HOA board issued a statement claiming the Johnsons were irresponsible homeowners, attempting to deflect from their violations. They painted the family as rule breakers, undermining the integrity of the community. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, warning residents that siding with the Johnsons would lower property values. The smear campaign was vicious, and Whitaker made it clear he would not back down. David and Carla felt the weight of the campaign pressing on them, but instead of folding, it ignited something deeper. They realized this was no longer just about their fence or their lawn. It was about dignity, justice, and the right to exist in a place they called home. The Johnsons began organizing. With help from the activist group, they set up small gatherings in their backyard. Neighbors came at first cautiously, then more openly, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. An elderly woman described how Whitaker fined her for having a wheelchair ramp deemed unsightly. A single mother explained how her child's playhouse had been ordered dismantled for being non-conforming. Each story added fuel to the growing sense of outrage. Malik, inspired by the meetings, began filming them on his phone. He created short videos, pairing his raw footage with narration that highlighted his family's fight. When he uploaded them online, they spread quickly, striking a chord with viewers who had faced their own housing struggles. The Johnsons' battle was no longer confined to their block. It was resonating across the city and beyond. Still, the EVA threat loomed. The HOA's lien remained in place, and foreclosure was a real possibility. Carla stayed awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining strangers walking through her home as though it were nothing but a piece of property on a list. David tried to stay strong, but even he couldn't ignore the pounding in his chest. Every time he saw an unfamiliar car parked near their house. And then came the breaking point. The HOA sent a final notice. If the fines were not paid within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. The number on the page was staggering, inflated beyond reason, a sum the Johnsons could never pay. Tears rolled down Carla's cheeks as she read the letter, but then something remarkable happened. Malik picked up his phone, recorded his mother's trembling hands holding the paper, and posted it online. His caption was simple: "This is what they're trying to do to us. They want to take our home. Will you let them?" The video exploded. Thousands of comments poured in, messages of support, outrage, and solidarity. Local news stations picked up the story. What had begun as one family's quiet struggle had become a public battle, a spotlight shining on the dark side of HOAs and the people who used them as weapons. Whitaker underestimated the Johnsons. He underestimated their resilience, their community, and the power of a story told at the right time. The Johnsons, once isolated and fearful, now stood at the center of a movement. Their home was still in jeopardy, but something had shifted. The HOA was no longer the only force in the room. Now the world was watching. And with the world watching, the Johnsons were determined to fight harder than ever. The Johnsons' quiet backyard had transformed into the heart of resistance. Folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows across the grass, the air buzzing with determination and anger in equal measure. What had once been a space for Malik's basketball games and Jasmine's birthday parties was now a gathering ground for voices too long silenced. The Johnsons weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They had become the symbol of everyone's pent-up frustrations with the HOAs. Overreach. Every evening neighbors filed in, some nervously looking over their shoulders, others defiantly carrying homemade signs. Carla had bought a second-hand whiteboard where she scribbled updates about legal deadlines and media coverage. David, who had once felt crushed under the weight of HOA threats, now stood taller, briefing the group on strategies and ways to gather more evidence. Even Malik and Jasmine played their parts, Malik documenting everything with his phone while Jasmine passed out water and snacks, her youthful determination striking a chord with the older residents. The gatherings began small, but word traveled quickly. Soon residents from nearby neighborhoods, people who had faced their own HOA nightmares, started showing up. Each story was more devastating than the last. Families fined into bankruptcy, homeowners forced to sell after being buried under impossible fees, retirees harassed over garden gnomes and wheelchair ramps. These weren't just isolated cases, they were patterns. Carla listened intently, her heart breaking but also hardening with resolve. This wasn't just about their fence or their lawn anymore. This was about a system that thrived on intimidation, one that targeted vulnerable families while protecting the interests of those with money and power. The media, once a distant force, had now become a constant presence. Local reporters filmed the backyard gatherings, their cameras capturing the emotion etched into the faces of residents who had suffered in silence for too long. National outlets began picking up the story too, framing it as a battle between a family clinging to their home and an HOA wielding unchecked authority. The Johnson struggle had become a rallying cry, sparking debates on talk shows and news segments about the abuse of HOAs across America. But with visibility came escalation. Whitaker and the HOA board doubled down, determined not to lose control. They hired a high-profile attorney known for defending corporate interests, a man who dismissed the Johnsons as habitual violators, exploiting public sympathy. The board issued new rules overnight, restrictions clearly designed to punish the family further. Signs were banned, gatherings were prohibited. Even the act of distributing water to neighbors was suddenly labeled a commercial activity against HOA regulations. Letters arrived almost daily now, each one dripping with condescension and threats of more fines. The HOA was no longer trying to appear reasonable. They wanted to break the Johnsons' spirit and send a message to anyone daring to side with them. Yet instead of retreating, the Johnsons grew louder. Carla began contacting civil rights organizations, explaining how the HOA's selective enforcement disproportionately targeted black families in the neighborhood. David started researching federal housing laws, discovering protections they might invoke. Malik's videos, raw and emotional, continued to circulate online, attracting not only sympathy, but also offers of legal advice and financial help. Donations trickled in from strangers who wanted to help cover their legal costs. Still, the stress was crushing. Every knock on the door made Carla's heart race, fearing it was the sheriff delivering foreclosure papers. David began losing weight, his appetite vanishing under the weight of constant anxiety. At night, Malik overheard his parents whispering, trying to mask their worry, and felt both protective and helpless. Jasmine, sensing more than her parents realized, began drawing pictures of their house with bold colors, as if she could will it to stay theirs forever. The breaking point came during one of their largest gatherings. More than 50 people had crowded into their yard, holding signs and chanting for justice. The energy was electric, a wave of defiance that seemed unstoppable. But then flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. Police cars pulled up, sirens piercing the night. Officers stepped out, their presence heavy and intimidating. Neighbors gasped, some backing away, others raising their phones to record. An officer announced that the gathering violated HOA rules and constituted an unlawful assembly. The irony was suffocating, police officers enforcing rules of a homeowners association as if it were law. David stepped forward, his hands trembling, but his voice steady, reminding the officer that this was private property. The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but after a tense standoff, the crowd refused to disperse. Eventually, the police withdrew, their retreat met with cheers from the residents, but the incident left scars. It was proof that the HOA wasn't afraid to weaponize every system at its disposal, from lawyers to law enforcement. The Johnsons realized they were not just fighting for their home, they were fighting for the right to exist freely in their own space. The next morning, Malik's footage of the police confrontation went viral. Millions watched as ordinary families stood up to intimidation, their voices refusing to be silenced. Commentators called it a modern civil rights moment, while others drew parallels to broader issues of systemic injustice. The Johnsons had become unwilling leaders of a movement, their story no longer just about offense or fines, but about power, race, and the fragile dream of home ownership in America. Yet, amidst the swelling support, the clock continued ticking. The 30-day deadline on the foreclosure notice loomed ever closer. Lawyers worked frantically, activists rallied harder, and neighbors grew bolder, but the threat remained. If the Johnsons couldn't find a way to halt the process legally, no amount of public outrage would keep the bank from seizing their home. Carla lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of Malik's phone as he edited videos in the next room. She thought of her grandmother, who had worked 3 jobs just to buy their first family home. She thought of the sacrifices, the pride of ownership, the countless Sundays spent cooking meals for extended family in the very kitchen they now risked losing. Tears slid down her face as she realized the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. The Johnsons had gone from being a quiet family struggling in silence to the face of a growing resistance. But the battle was far from over. Their home still hung in the balance, their fate entangled in a system designed to grind people down. And with the deadline for foreclosure drawing near, one question haunted them all. Would the movement they sparked be enough to save not just their house but their future? The Johnsons' living room had turned into a war room. Stacks of papers lined the coffee table, legal documents, letters from the HOA, news clippings, and petitions signed by hundreds of neighbors. Every surface carried evidence of the fight, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the outcome. The foreclosure deadline loomed like a storm cloud, its shadow growing darker by the day. Carla sat with her laptop open, her face illuminated by the bluish glow of the screen. She scrolled through emails, reading words of encouragement from strangers, activists, and even attorneys offering pro bono support. Each message was a lifeline, but none could erase the gnawing fear that time was slipping away. David leaned against the window, staring out at the yard, his jaw tight. Their once peaceful street now felt like a battlefield. The HOA, refusing to yield, had filed an emergency motion to fast-track foreclosure. It was a move designed not only to reclaim the Johnsons' property, but also to crush the momentum of the growing movement. Whitaker, the HOA president, was no longer simply enforcing rules. He was defending his power. Behind him stood developers eager to gentrify the neighborhood, their promises of glossy new homes and upscale businesses built on the erasure of families like the Johnsons. But if Whitaker expected the Johnsons to bow quietly, he miscalculated. The family doubled down. Carla coordinated with civil rights attorneys, who argued that the HOA's selective enforcement amounted to discrimination. David worked on collecting affidavits from neighbors who had witnessed similar harassment or who had been unfairly fined themselves. Malik continued to release videos that spread across social media, painting the Johnsons not as victims, but as fighters standing tall in the face of injustice. Jasmine, with her youthful innocence, had become the quiet symbol of what was at stake, the future of children who deserved to grow up in stability, not fear. The turning point came when a coalition of housing rights organizations announced they would stage a rally in front of the courthouse the day of the Johnsons' hearing. What began as a local dispute was about to become a national spectacle. The family, once isolated, now had an army behind them. Still, the pressure was suffocating. Every night, Carla lay awake, her mind racing with what-ifs. What if they lost the house? What if the bank refused to delay the process? What if Malik and Jasmine had to watch their childhood home stripped away piece by piece? David, though outwardly steady, carried the same fears. He replayed the image of his children's faces whenever the topic of foreclosure came up, and it cut deeper than any fine or insult ever could. The night before the hearing, neighbors gathered in the Johnsons' yard one last time. Candles lit. The space, casting a golden glow on the faces of those who had become more like family than friends. Stories were shared, prayers were whispered, and promises were made that no matter the outcome, they would continue the fight. The Johnsons didn't realize it then, but their backyard gathering had become something more powerful than protest. It was a vigil for dignity, community, and hope. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold gray sky, the air heavy with anticipation. Outside the courthouse, crowds assembled, their signs bold and defiant. Homes, not harassment. Stop HOA abuse. Justice for the Johnsons. Television cameras lined the sidewalks, their lenses hungry for every angle of the unfolding drama. The Johnsons walked hand in hand through the sea of supporters, their presence met with cheers, applause, and chants that echoed down the street. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. On one side sat the HOA's legal team, polished and smug, their arguments neatly packaged in leather binders. On the other sat the Johnsons and their attorney, armed with determination and a growing mountain of evidence. The judge, stern and deliberate, reminded the room that this was not a media circus, though the weight of the cameras outside made it impossible to separate justice from spectacle. The HOA's lawyer began his case with the cold precision of someone used to winning. He painted the Johnsons as reckless homeowners who had ignored repeated violations, portraying their resistance as nothing more than defiance of community rules. He spoke of overgrown plants, improper fences, and gatherings that disturbed the peace. His words were sharp, but beneath them lingered the unmistakable subtext: this family did not belong. Then came the Johnsons' turn. Their attorney laid out the facts with clarity, exposing the pattern of harassment, the selective enforcement, and the connections between Whitaker and the developers. Witnesses took the stand, neighbors who testified about their own experiences, activists who spoke about broader patterns of abuse, and even experts who explained how gentrification tactics often weaponized HOAs to drive out families. But it wasn't the legal arguments alone that carried weight. It was the Johnsons themselves. Carla's voice cracked as she described the fear of losing the only home her children had ever known. David spoke of the pride he felt the day they signed the mortgage, and the shame he carried watching his family threatened with eviction over petty rules. Malik's testimony, detailing the impact on his mental health and his sense of belonging, silenced the room. And when Jasmine, in her small but steady voice, said she didn't want to leave the place where she learned to ride her bike, the judge shifted uncomfortably. Hours passed, arguments clashing like waves against the shore. The courthouse air grew thick with anticipation. Outside, chants rose and fell, a steady heartbeat of solidarity. Reporters huddled, ready to broadcast. The verdict that would ripple far beyond this single case. As the day drew to a close, the judge announced that a decision would not be made immediately. The evidence was extensive, the claims serious, and the implications far-reaching. The hearing was adjourned, the ruling to be delivered in the coming days. The Johnsons walked out of the courthouse exhausted but unbroken. Cameras flashed, microphones pressed forward, voices shouted questions. Supporters cheered, their faith in the family's fight unshaken. Though no verdict had been reached, the Johnsons had already won something greater. They had forced the system to see them, to hear them, to recognize their humanity. Yet the uncertainty remained. The foreclosure deadline loomed, and without a ruling, the threat of losing everything still hung over their heads. The battle was not finished. The hardest chapter still lay ahead. The days following the hearing felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath every step. The Johnsons lived in suspended time, their home filled with whispers of fear and glimmers of hope. Each ring of the phone, each letter in the mailbox sent Carla's pulse racing. Would this be the notice that sealed their fate, or the message that saved them? The neighborhood, once ordinary, had become a fortress of solidarity. Neighbors dropped off meals, donated money, and checked in daily. Strangers from across the country sent letters, their words of encouragement taped to the Johnsons' refrigerator. As a wall of strength, Malik turned their yard into a command post, recording updates and rallying supporters online. Every video carried the same raw plea: "This is bigger than us. This is about every family fighting to keep their home." But as the foreclosure deadline loomed closer, the weight of uncertainty grew unbearable. David often wandered the rooms at night, his hand grazing the walls, as though memorizing the texture of the place he might lose. Carla, though outwardly composed, carried an exhaustion that etched deeper lines across her face. Even the children, though shielded from the harshest details, sensed the heaviness. Jasmine clung to her toys a little tighter, and Malik's once easy laughter had turned into quiet resolve. Then, on a grey Friday morning, the decision arrived. The Johnsons gathered in the courthouse once again, their supporters filling the pews behind them, their chants echoing faintly from outside. Cameras lined the halls ready to broadcast history. Whitaker and his attorneys sat on the other side, still smug, though a flicker of unease had crept into their eyes. The judge entered, the room falling into tense silence. Papers shuffled. Her throat cleared, and then the ruling began. The judge spoke slowly, her words measured and deliberate. She acknowledged the Johnsons' violations. Yes, the grass had been overgrown, yes, the fence had not conformed to guidelines, but these were not, she said, violations worthy of foreclosure. What she saw instead was a pattern of selective enforcement, evidence of discrimination, and actions that appeared motivated not by community welfare, but by personal and financial interests. The courtroom shifted. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Finally, the words came: the foreclosure was halted. The fines deemed excessive were nullified. The HOA was ordered to pay damages to the Johnsons and submit to an external audit of its practices. And most striking of all, Whitaker himself was removed from his role, his conduct labeled a breach of trust and abuse of power. For a moment, silence reigned. Then the courtroom erupted. Supporters cheered, reporters rushed forward, cameras flashed like lightning. Carla gasped, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. David pulled her into an embrace, his body shaking as years of fear, anger, and exhaustion poured out at once. Malik slammed his fist against the bench in triumph, his face lit with joy. Jasmine clapped her little hands together, her voice rising above the noise. "We get to stay." Outside the courthouse, the celebration exploded into the streets. Neighbors danced, signs waved, and chants echoed, "Justice for the Johnsons, justice for us all." The family stood at the steps, overwhelmed by the sea of people who had rallied for them, strangers and friends alike. Their fight had never just been about one house. It had been about the dignity of every family threatened by unchecked power. That night, back in their home, the Johnsons sat together in the living room. The papers were gone, the legal binders packed away. Instead, the space glowed with laughter, the scent of home-cooked meals, and the quiet hum of relief. For the first time in months, the house felt like a sanctuary again, not a battlefield. David walked out onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air. The street was quiet now, but he could still feel the pulse of the community that had risen with them. He realized their story would not end here. They had become a symbol, their fight sparking conversations across the country about HOA abuse, gentrification, and the right of ordinary families to live in peace. Carla joined him, her hand slipping into his. She whispered that she wanted to start a foundation, something to help other families facing similar struggles. David nodded, knowing this was only the beginning of a new chapter, not of fear but of purpose. Inside, Malik was already sketching out plans for his next video, determined to use his platform to shine light on injustices beyond their block. Jasmine curled on the couch, finally able to sleep deeply, her childhood safe once more within the walls she knew. The Johnsons had faced the unimaginable, a powerful HOA determined to erase them, a system that had nearly crushed them, and the looming loss of their dream. But in standing together, they had not only saved their home, they had sparked a movement. The final lesson of their journey was clear. Power does not belong to those who seek to exploit and intimidate. Power lives in community, in unity, in the courage of families who refuse to be silenced. The Johnson story would echo long after the courthouse ruling, a reminder that justice can prevail, even against the strongest odds. And so the family that nearly lost everything reclaimed not just their house, but their future. Their home stood tall, not as a prize, but as a testament. No HOA, no developer, no scheme could ever erase the power of love, defiance, and solidarity. Their dream was safe, their fight had been worth it, and their story was far from over. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.